All
Mm.
right, so this is an article from Firestone and Scholl from 2016. Cognition does not affect perception, evaluating the evidence for top-down effects. And by Shaz Firestone, who is an assistant professor at Johns Hopkins, and Brian Scholl, who's a professor at Yale. And I wanted to lead a discussion on this article is because it's quite an entertaining read, because there were hundreds of articles already out there that were purporting to have evidence that cognition does affect perception. And they're saying that they don't believe any of that evidence and that it's all wrong, essentially. Then, they put out this article and they get a lot of backlash, understandably. But they actually decide to publish all of their backlash in an amendment to their article, own feedback to the backlash, explaining why their backlash was still wrong. So we'll first talk about what cognitive penetrability means. Examples for cognition influencing perception, examples against, the counter arguments, the back and forth that the article has, general comments by me, and as well as some general comments throughout. And anybody can feel free to chime in at any time with their own comments or opinions. If you're not able to use the voice chat, it's totally fine to just type it in, and I can respond to the typed in text as well. You'll just have to follow me on the slides manually, I suppose. Cognitive penetrability is essentially what we see is influenced by what we think. So when I say what we see, I'm not talking about the literal visual input that's being sent through the eyes hitting the retina. I'm talking about the percept that we see as a result of that visual input. This is the process of transforming the visual input from the retina to the image that we perceive may be influenced by cognitive factors, and that might include motivation, desire, emotions, presentations. And the idea is that these cognitive factors are influencing our input that is different from what the actual outside world is. And in this paper, we're basically just going to be addressing visual perception. Of course, other senses, and these can also apply to cognitive penetrability. But basically, the vast majority of studies with visual perception, so we're going to constrain the discussion to vision. On the next slide. Actually, before that, the example with the banana. This is one study where the evidence is that people look at a gray banana. Their percept of that banana is that it is slightly tinged yellow. So it's black and white, but because we associate a banana with its yellow the vast majority of the time, we are automatically biasing our visual perception to the direction of seeing a little bit of yellow in the image. In the example, it's saturated, the dim yellow, but that's just to make it more obvious what the paper's trying to say. They're trying to say that you can look at that input, and that input is itself already biased when you're looking at it. And we'll get into how they measured this in a bit. So some other examples, top left of slide 4, there's a heart and a circle, and they're both the same color, but we associate a prototypical heart shape with the color red, and also with like and love is associated with red. And so that was looking into this said that people literally see the heart as a little bit redder than the circle. Another study that used the same geometric shapes, and this time just put the Coca-Cola logo on top of one of the red circles. And the Coca-Cola logo with their trademark red color, we again see the shape as being slightly redder than usual. Another example, perhaps a bit more extreme, is imagine that there are two linguistic communities. One of those communities, they have certain words for different colors. And in this community, orange is encompassing this as many other colors. And in another community, they have a different term for that is a different. So you can imagine segmenting the color wheel into different terms to describe colors. And the idea is that if you have these different terms that describe the colors that you're seeing, this can literally bias how you are perceiving the. When I first study about the Himba tribe, which I remember, I think I first heard about it on Radiolab, and I know that there was also there was a BBC documentary that featured this example as well. But the Himba tribe, I think they're in Namibia in Africa, and they don't have a color, they don't have a word to describe the difference between blue and green. Many words to describe different colors of green. So what the researchers did, went to this tribe and they presented them with a circular arrangement of different colored patches. Patches was a different color than the rest. So in the left example, patch, and then the rest of the patches are green. And the Himba tribe they had a lot of difficulty distinguishing patch from the green. They couldn't tell what the oddball was in the array. But if you presented them with the array on the right, which is all greens aside from one off green, they were easily able to distinguish that slightly different green from the rest of the greens. And yet we assumedly cannot do that. I know I can't, looking at that array, so I had to outline it with a red circle. And great example when I remembered it, and the authors of this paper don't talk about it at all. It was just an example that came to mind. And I thought that this was really this is evidence that cognition, or how we learn about things, this is influencing our perception of colors, because I can't even tell the green from the greens because I assumedly don't enough color labels. But in doing a bit more into the literature, it turns out that the entire study is a fraud. So the researchers never got published. In fact, all to suggest that the study was credible in any way. And the BBC apparently just ran with it. And because it's BBC, Radiolab, and then other, okay, that's a great example. And tons of news outlets also were writing about it. Yeah, nothing to conclude about that example, but it is what we can consider our perception. If it were true, that is. Stepping back for a little, why do we care if cognition can influence our perception anyway? So, assume that what we see generally is what is out there in the world, right? And I'm enjoying the summer heat or whatever, and I'm thinking this is a beautiful Am I actually looking at a beautiful outlet? What if my entire perception is a ruse, you know? And we know that the outside world isn't always end up perceiving. So in the optical illusion on the right, the two middle circles are the same size, but it's very difficult to, just by looking at it, think that those two middle circles are actually the same size. It's very convincing that is larger than the circle on the right. So I guess the fundamental question is, how do we trust what we see? And do we have control over what we see? As in the case of the illusions, that we don't have a one-to-one relationship between the outside world and our perception. On the topic of optical illusions, these are some optical illusions that the authors of the paper talk about. So on the left, the gray center square is apparently lighter, or it looks lighter than the one on the right. In the column of gray patches on the left looks lighter than the column of gray patches on the right, even though all of the grays are the same color. The way that Firestone and Scholl put it is that no matter how well we understand the processes underlying visual perception, we will always illusions. So like the two grays will look different even though they're actually the same, and there's nothing we can do to the same perceptually. And that's why these optical illusions are not evidence that cognition influences perception, even though our perception is not one-to-one in this case. Taking a bit of a farther step in that they're claiming that all of visual cognition is like these illusions. So no matter what cognitive factor you can think of, desire, motivation, language, you eventually are outputting is going to remain the same. I just wanted to show, by the way, gray patches are actually the same. And when I was putting together this slide, I made these little, gray shapes by using the eyedropper tool to make sure I had the correct gray hue. And I found that the gray hues don't actually line up. The illusion on the left works in that I can put this gray rectangle between the two, and you can tell they're the same gray. But on the illusion on the right, I think that they printed something wrong. The print screen of the paper, but that gray rectangle, it's not showing that they're all the same color. The bottom right rectangle of the right gray column is darker than the rest. He needs to step up his game because these illusions aren't even valid. I can't believe the quality of these Yale papers. Anyway, moving on. Funny, like, wow, I really convinced me. Oh, okay, it's not the case. Basically, the authors of this paper don't go into any neuroimaging work. They don't really care about, how the brain is connected and processing visual input into eventual percept. There is a lot of literature on what is called reentrant processing, cognitive regions of the brain, and modulate the processing of earlier visual areas. By some people is that if this is the case, isn't that evidence enough? If you have literature to say, if you have like fMRI studies that show back processing, but Firestone and Scholl say that this is a bit too ambiguous. It's clear that reentrant processing is a thing. It's unclear whether one influencing the input or if it's influencing the actual process of transforming the visual input. And unclear, you really can't use that as evidence. They also say that this processing of this reentrant processing is going to happen not. So even if it is showing that maybe it's in how the visual cortex is interpreting these signals, if it was going to happen automatically level area, it's still simply nothing that you have control over. Basically, we're just going off of behavioral findings at this point. So now getting into the actual complaints of the authors. In the El Greco fallacy, El Greco was a famous painter and was such that his paintings were very, they appeared stretched. Because of that, a lot of people thought that perhaps literally saw things as stretched because his paintings look stretched. This is succumbing to a fallacy, because if everything that this painter saw looked stretched, then his canvas would have also looked stretched. Things should have looked normal, because he would have been painting on a stretched canvas, would have canceled out any distortions that his visual system actually had. El Greco literally saw things stretched. It doesn't really have merit, but this is the same sort of fallacy that a lot of have succumbed to. So for instance, the next slide, there's a study that said that reflecting on unethical actions makes the world literally appear darker. They asked participants to recall and describe in detail either an ethical or an unethical deed from their past, and to describe any feelings or emotions associated with it. They used a 7-point scale, and subjects simply used the scale to determine if the room was brighter or darker. So Firestone and Scholl decided to replicate this study. Using the 7-point scale, they used color patches ranging from black to white, still 7 color patches. And the idea of this is that if they were literally seeing the world as darker, color patches as darker as well. And so if there was still an effect, participants were picking the darker color patches, then this wouldn't make any sense. If the original study was correct, that they wouldn't have found any effect, which shows that something else is going on than simply affecting perception. It could be a response bias. It could be the participants thinking that, like, this is the goal of the study, I'm going to report darker room. It could be a number of things, but the idea is that we need to have this sort of against the hypothesis that cognition is actually affecting perception by using the El Greco fallacy. It's an overly confirmatory research strategy to not use such an of response that would equally be likely to not have an effect as to have an effect. Authors then, they outline multiple different pitfalls that multiple different studies fall under. One of those is this idea of perception versus judgment. So perception, were they measuring some sort of judgment response that is unrelated. So as an example, there was a study, groups of subjects. One group estimated the size of a target before throwing darts at it, and the other estimated the size of the target after throwing darts at it. And subjects threw these darts until they hit the target. That estimated after they threw their darts, the number of darts thrown until hitting the target negatively correlated with size estimates. So in other words, if they had to throw the darts more times to eventually hit the board, they perceived the board as literally smaller. And that increased effort leads to this change of perception where the board is perceived as smaller than it was before. Now, this is another example where we're able to replicate it and show that this is not exactly what's going on. So for instance, if the researchers gave them these darts and they told the participants that the darts were flawed in some way, then the effect disappears. So as if the participants have an out for their lazy or poor technique, then they no longer show any difference in their perceptual output, which doesn't really make much sense at the conclusion of the original study. So does someone literally perceive the world differently, or are they just responding in a way that makes it seem like they're perceiving the world differently? Participants could attribute their bad performance to faulty darts instead of the size of the dartboard, then there are different results. It's another example that the authors give. There was a study where conservatives ranked photos of Obama that were darker in appearance as more phrase that the conservatives ranked photos of Obama as literally being darker than liberals who showed the opposite trend. This is saying that political bias can literally influence how you perceive of a president. If you think about it in a different way, they give an example of if they had showed Obama with red horns or a halo, participants would probably have said that the red horns was like more representative of what the photo actually looks like. I mean, participants may not literally be perceiving Obama as lighter or darker in appearance, be thinking to themselves, yeah, this is a dark photo of Obama. I think of Obama as darker if I'm a conservative. And then they agree with the researcher who's asking if this dark photo of Obama is representative of what Obama literally looks like. They state that for these sort of judgment-based tasks, it's better if studies used performance-based measures. Success ties directly to how well they perceive the stimuli. So for instance, don't make the on possible judgment-based effects. You should have their performance. You should tell them that they're doing better the more accurate they are to the actual stimulus. So if you're doing a visual search task, for instance, and you're doing worse, then you're like matching photos, then this is probably less likely to be due to this sort of intrinsic thinking about your opinions on either an image, or you trying to make it seem like you're not actually a horrible dart thrower. Perception and judgment are not always one-to-one, and that needs to be considered. Another typical example of this cognition influencing perception, they had subjects wear a heavy backpack a hill, and then the subjects had to how slanted or how steep the hill was, and where subjects were given this heavy backpack, they ranked the hill as looking steeper than another group of people who were not wearing backpacks. Also later proved misleading because if you, when replicating the study, told these subjects that were wearing the backpacks that they were only holding the backpack in order to hold on to some heavy monitoring equipment during climbing, so if they justify the purpose of the backpack, this effect of heavy backpacks on slant estimation. So that is evidence. Then it's pretty clear that these experimenters were giving the subjects these backpacks, and then the subjects are thinking to themselves, why do they give me a backpack? Oh, I have to make a slant judgment. Okay, maybe I should use this knowledge of me now being it's going to be harder now to climb the hill. That maybe has something to do with what they're testing, and that might influence their response. I guess there's 2 points on that. Subjects might be smarter than we give them credit for. And also that response bias might actually have something to do with these conclusions based on perception. All that they explain is these low-level differences studies. So some studies admit that there are alternative explanations for their findings. So for instance, one study, African-American faces and Caucasian faces, and subjects had to rate how light or dark the face looked. And the researchers were saying to themselves, okay, we should match the low-level information between these photos, and that way we can get a better. That's not going to be, influenced by luminance or of gray or brown or white. We can say that they're all the exact same luminance value, and so if people say that the black faces look darker, then it's because of some sort of cognitive factor influencing their perception. Taken as very good evidence at the time, because if you look at the two stimuli, the literally does look darker than the face on the right. What they were claiming about black and white faces and how they influence perception. The banana example, where you can look at that gray banana and you're not necessarily going to see any yellow in there, even though the researchers are saying that you would. In this example, you can tell that there's some sort of difference going on. Again, it's not as easy as making as it sounds, I guess. Firestone and Scholl, again, replicated this study. And this time they blurred out the faces so you couldn't tell what race the face was. When they did that and then asked subjects to do the same exact task, people still rated as looking darker than the face on the right. And possible if you were to say that it's the race information that's playing a role in making people say that one face looks darker than the other. The reason for this discrepancy in results is because the perceived visual cues for lighting are different in the two examples. So the black face appears to be under illumination. The white face does not. The black face has a darker jawline. The white face has darker eyes. That conclude that it's race that's inducing the differences. Were to point here is that accommodating for low-level differences is an admirable but difficult task. Researchers made all the stimuli the same overall luminance. They didn't consider visual cues such as lighting. And how are you ever going to account for all the low-level differences? It almost seems like going down a rabbit hole at some point. That's one thing that I was thinking of when considering these low-level differences. All right, and the last, or second to last, are these peripheral attention effects. So we know that if we attend to an object, it appears clearer and more detailed.
Mm.
That if you control over your perception, they're saying that attention is akin to that. Attention is influencing the input to make it more clear, more detailed, or any number of things. Control over closing your eyes, this is not evidence that cognition affects perception.
Mm-hmm.
They say that attention is a perceptual thing and not a cognitive thing. Before cognition has a chance to play a role.
Wow.
I had some thoughts about the attention part.
Obviously.
Yeah. On the next slide, I have the Necker cube. This is a good illusion because you can swap between different interpretations of the Necker cube. You can consciously go between the aerial view and the straightforward view. And this is different from the optical illusions from before. In those optical illusions, you couldn't do anything to change how you perceived that illusion. But in the Necker cube, you can, to an extent. Scholl are saying that basically, whether you see the top-down view or the straightforward view, attention effect. So where you're attending to on the Necker cube is determining how you perceive that Necker cube, and thus it is again an example of input being changed as a result of attention, and that is not cognition. That's occurring before cognitive processing to take over. Because in a sense, when you think of attention as an input or as a perceptual influence, basically the visual system is becoming more or less sensitive to different or aspects of visual input. And it's that gets fed into the later cognitive system potentially and perception and your output. The Necker cube example as if you look at the middle example of the face overlaid on top of a place, you can flip-flop between whether you're looking at you're attending to the face or you're attending to the house. The face, it sort of blurs out the house, and it's more clear and detailed to attend to the face, even though they're encompassing the same area. So you can consciously attend to one or the other, just like you can consciously attend to the top-down or the straightforward view of the cube. Next down is with something like the dress illusion. A lot of people see the dress as white or gold, white and gold. Others see it as blue and black. This is something that we can't easily, yet many people perceive differently. Okay, when I originally saw this, I thought it was white and gold, and then a week later,
Really?
black. And I haven't been able to switch back.
Oh, interesting. Oh, I saw this as blue and brown.
I haven't heard that one before. We'll always say blue and black. I think you must be one of those outliers.
Actually, there was a study with over 1,000 people. About 60% of people perceive this as blue and black, and 30% perceive this as white and gold, and 10% perceive this as blue and brown.
Oh, interesting.
And also, there is another study that actually the morning person tends to perceive this as white and gold, and the night person tends to perceive this as blue and black because their brain how the brain interprets the surrounding light is different. So the morning person assume that the background light is under the daylight, and the night person assume that it's under the artificial light. So so the part the brain discounts is different.
I remember reading about, that's really interesting. I remember reading something about how like older people see it as, I think
White and gold.
younger
Older
people see
people.
it as blue and black.
Yeah, right. Older people and women
Adolescent.
tends to perceive as white and gold. I don't know why.
How people are accustomed to interpreting it based on artificial lighting cues.
Mm.
In a way, it doesn't really make sense with what the article is claiming. For instance, let's assume that we have no control over whether we see it as blue and black or white and gold. It's basically some having different interpretations of contextual lighting cues. And so all of our visual systems are built somewhat differently, and the solution is taking advantage of the slight sensitivities that we have to different lighting cues, right? That might be one interpretation. It's not cognition influencing perception because all of our visual systems are simply visual input depending on our different relationship with how we perceive contextual cues. But it doesn't make sense because in my example, and I flip-flopped between white and gold to blue and black. And so that would mean that I somehow reconfigured to interpret lighting cues differently within that time, and then still never be able to go back to my original.
Interesting. So isn't it because that you knew this dress original color is blue and black?
That's a good point. It wasn't known yet whether it was truly blue and black or whether it was white and gold. So eventually the person who bought the dress, and so it was blue and black. But I think at that point, side effect, I made a bet with my roommate that he said it was white and gold, so I decided to take the other bet and say it was blue and black. And then the day after, I couldn't even see it as white and gold anymore.
Weird.
But I would be interested to see what and Scholl think of the dress example.
Right.
A one-of-a-kind optical illusion. So the next pitfall that Firestone and Scholl talk about relates to memory and recognition. In one study, subjects were briefly presented with morally relevant or morally irrelevant words. So for instance, a relevant word might be illegal, a relevant word might be limited. Were presented with these words one at a time in a rapid sequence, and subjects had to say whether they were presented with a word or a non-word. So the words were presented quickly and then quickly masked. So it was difficult to do. Results were that subjects had an easier time distinguishing the morally relevant words, morally irrelevant words, subjects, or I guess the conclusion is that morally relevant words are easier to perceive than morally irrelevant words. That morally relevant words pop out to you. Firestone and Scholl took this as this is top-down effects on perception in terms of we recognize things. So in this example, a huge factor might be priming. We'll see morally relevant words again and again and again. And they also see morally irrelevant words. But the morally relevant words might prime other morally relevant words. And words might have nothing to do with the other morally irrelevant words. More primed to be ready to see a word that has something to do with morality, or to respond or to say that this is a word. And Firestone and Scholl replicated the study. I forget what it was, something like furniture, I think. Words related to furniture or words related to something else. If you this study with furniture, then the pop-out effect. And that doesn't make any sense. Perceive furniture words as more easily than all other words. That's one way to disconfirm it. But basically, this memory and recognition pitfall has to do with any study that's using like linguistic labels for testing. It's not really a demonstration of cognitive penetrability if people are faster to recognize something just because they have a label assigned to what they're recognizing. If you are presented with a fuzzy image, label that fuzzy image as a kangaroo, you're presented with other fuzzy images as well, but you don't assign a label to it. Later on, you're presented with these fuzzy images again. It might be easier to recognize the fuzzy image that you've attributed the label of kangaroo. Doesn't mean that you're perceiving the fuzzy image any better than all of the other images. Label, and thus it might be easier to retrieve from memory because you've associated something with it. Improvement in visual processing, but an improvement in memory retrieval. As another example, this example is not going to work at all because I had it converted into Google Slides. So on the next slide, we have a picture on the left. Maybe none of you saw the gray image that was on the left. Did you see it? Basically, if you see this black and white image on the left, you probably won't be able to tell what it is at all. But if I throw in the actual image that it was composed of originally, help but see it for what it is, a frog.
So if you play this slide, then actually I can see the original picture.
Are you in presentation mode? I'm just going slide by slide outside of it.
Oh, yeah, I click the play button and I can see the original picture of the
okay. Right. Well, foiled based on to see it at different times. If after you see the original image, that's going to change how you see it in the future. We can't now show you the black and white frog to perceive it as you would have perceived it before you saw the original picture.
Mm.
Going to work. You're always
Right.
going to see the black and white image now for what it truly is. Even if I showed you this image like a year from now, you're probably going to see it as the frog still. You're never going to be able to go back. But does this mean that cognition has influenced our perception? Not really. It just means that we now have this memory retrieval going on as an added aspect. It doesn't necessarily mean that we are altering our cognition, because now it's still happening regardless of whether we want it to or not. Control over it. We've just established a connection between this specific visual input and a memory cue associated with what it actually is. On the right, I found this on Reddit like a week ago, and wow, this person has really shiny legs. This person has shiny legs.
No.
Well, if you read the comments to this picture, actually just took like white paint. Their legs were glistening. Have this information. It's hard to perceive the legs as they originally were, as glistening and shiny. It's white paint. It goes to being some shiny wax legs into being some failed art project. To go back. And that's, again, an example of knowledge influencing our perception, but not necessarily being influencing our perception. It's just adding this new link associated with certain visual input. I just thought that was a pretty cool example. People fooled in the chat. And Paul put some freakish nude net legs in the PowerPoint. So on the next slide, going back to the original banana example, they find that the banana had a tinge of yellow to it. The procedure was that they showed this grayscale. No, they showed the yellow banana originally, had to adjust the color of the banana until it now appeared neutral on the screen. Like they could use their mouse to adjust the image. And when they feel like they've made the image as neutral in color as possible, then they click OK. And people generally overcorrected the color. And so the final result was a banana with a slight blue tinge. What the authors deduced from that is that they were perceiving the yellow banana as yellower than it actually, necessarily yellower than it actually was, but when they made it gray, it still had a tinge of yellow. So they had to overcorrect for that tinge of yellow that they assigned to it. There was a blue banana. So the authors, their complaint about this study is that even if the gray bananas, this can still not imply cognitive impenetrability. It's my own little opinion here. When I read that sentence, I'm like, come on, what can penetrability? They just admitted that the gray banana can look yellow. It does make some sense. So they said it could be a form of perceptual learning. So visual sensitivity during input. This is a huge effect side. There might be a response bias. So the subject is given this task. They have a yellow banana. They need to make it gray. And so the subject is like, okay, I need to eliminate the yellow, right? And so they pay attention to the yellow, any of the other colors as much. And so in their effort to eliminate all the yellow, they are overcorrecting not mean that they were perceiving the gray banana as tinged with yellow. It just might mean that they were paying more attention to the yellow color. That's what the original image was, and that's what bananas are typically like. And so it could just be a response bias. Also test for this. So they didn't do this study, but they suspect that after adjusting a banana to look gray, but in fact be blue, bluish banana next to an objectively gray patch, or alternatively an objectively blue patch that matches the realize, oh no, I mistakenly made my banana a little bit blue. And they said that this might be a good follow-up study to really tell whether this works or not. Another comment that I had about this study was that gray bananas looking yellow does not imply ability if scale image appearing as not great due to the knowledge of the object. Why does it matter if knowing that the image is of a banana matter to our altered visual sensitivity? That's probably a confusing way to put it, but I guess if we have control over our altered, right? This is basically just complaining about attention. If attention is able to alter our sensitivity to visual input over attention, and doesn't that infer that we have control over the eventual output of that make sense? Going from visual input to the retina, and then the input being transformed in some way by attention, that being fed into the possible cognitive processing, that leading to our perception. They say that attention is simply altering our perceptual input. But if we have control over that perceptual input, isn't that basically change our perception?
Right, I agree.
About feature-based attention, right? So for the red thing, and thus you're more sensitive to red items. You have control to make your visual system more sensitive to red. Far extreme, and somehow you were able to alter your visual sensitivity so that every object that you looked at looked like a kangaroo. I mean, I have control over my visual system if I'm able to take it that far, you know? Yes, it's changing the input and not necessarily the processing of that input. I can change the input before it gets processed to that extent, then it's essentially control over my perception.
Right.
Definitional. Because if we only use their definition of what cognitive penetrability is, then yeah, attention is completely unrelated to the input. But I don't know if we need to constrain cognition affecting perception to such so some concluding counter arguments by some other academics. So Gary Lupian, I think he did one of the previous studies we were complaining about. So he says that perception cannot be assumed to be a modular, independent system. Firestone and Scholl are assuming that attention changes the input to a putatively modular visual system. It cannot be assumed to be such an independent system. This is essentially what I was just arguing. a little bit different. I'm saying it can still be a modular independent system, and still there's a problem. He's saying, he's saying that perception cannot be assumed to be independent. Saying even if it were independent, it's still a problem. The authors Firestone and Scholl Harry's argument by saying that attention may be a genuine explanation, just as long as attention sometimes changes input to later visual processing. Attentional effects must be actively ruled out by careful experimental tests of the sort sketched in our article. This is just a definitional problem, I'd say. So it's kind of hard to rule one way or the other. Says that perception in multiple levels of processing, and it is likely incorrect to relegate its role only to the gating of input into early vision. That you are studying selective attention and input level effect that does not violate the encapsulation of seeing from thinking. They said that if we assume that attention multiple levels, that also means that it does, to some extent, guide early perceptual input. It needs to be empirically tested. The categorization of a stimulus can change the likelihood that we see it in the first place. Manipulated categorization by altering orientation, a low-level difference. Actually, Firestone and Scholl are complaining about one article that's Steve was citing, an emotion-induced blindness paper. To some extent, attention will always have some role in early visual input. That attention influences both the input and also later processes, right? Let's assume that it has influence over multiple levels. Can't really say anything because it does still, to some degree, influence that input. And any effects that we see may be due to that small change to the input and not anything else. Without all of that, everything else, or we have to rule out the input must be due to the other levels of processing in order to make any claim of perception or cognition. A difficult thing to do. And Carter said that perception is obviously affected by top-down cognition because of mental imagery. We can literally perceive something in our mind's eye. And Scholl just said, nope, I don't agree. And even if that were the case, so what? That is a direct quote. And if mental imagery and perception share characteristics, they differ in vividness, speed, effortfulness, and these differences allow for a distinguishing from imagery and perception. They're basically saying that is this weird qualifying elements to make it distinguished from any of the other literature, and we can't really use mental imagery because it's too outside the norm of any other typical perception and cognition. It's sort of like a sub-process that encapsulates multiple aspects of different things. Honestly, this is just kind of counter arguments that the people give, and I think that the complaint about the terminology input are these separate independent systems, and then mental imagery is just a whole different category, apparently. Finally, I just had some concluding comments. So, the article in terms of how it was laid out. It was a very interesting read because of the sort of arguments, the back and forth between criticism and the repeated empirical tests of replicating prior studies using protocol. And I think he did a really good job in that sense. It made me really think that, yeah, these articles were flawed. Way. But it's about like early perceptual filters and attention that doesn't really get addressed. And while that is like a pretty big concern, overall, I did heavily agree with the article. Good arguments, and I had this preconceived notion that are interpreting the brain as sort of a black box when it comes to influencing perception. Like they're not going to pay attention to the imaging work. They're just going to how does this experiment lead to this behavior, and then everything that's in between is essentially irrelevant if we consider this as fact, that cognition does not influence perception. They make a lot of good claims, and so some complaints about like definitions. I think they explain things pretty well. That's all that I have. If anyone has like comments or any questions, they did a good job. Do you have complaints? Do you think that they didn't account for many things? Are you now convinced that cognition doesn't influence perception? To what extent their argument is predicated entirely on visual studies? Yeah, look at visual studies. They're basically fine cognition influencing perception entirely in visual, and based on the fact that hundreds of studies have attempted to shed evidence, and none of them have run into these several pitfalls that the authors line up. It's essentially them claiming that cognition doesn't influence perception, because if it did, we should have had at least one study to all of these pitfalls. And also, everybody seems to be doing visual stuff, so that's why they were using visual studies. They don't really try to like do their own study to show evidence. They're basically just saying everybody else is wrong. Speech perception, top-down influence on intelligibility. I mean, they talk about linguistic relativity, but that's still in the frame of visual perception. Top-down influence on intelligibility. How intelligible speech is, like how much they can understand speech. Like your ability to speak different languages leads to different interpretations of degraded speech. What's the difference between sensation and perception? It's probably going to be degraded because of the noisy place you're in. and that might have an influence on how intelligible I'm able to understand what you're saying. Between sensation and perception, what is the difference? Sensation is what? Like you being able to interpret your senses, right? It's how you sensation understood, like the same thing. I don't really know. Hmm. I mean, let's say that training ability of speech, give it for these people with cochlear implants. You could see that still being changing the input. So let's say that the whole reason that training works better, plasticity or the auditory cortex getting better at receiving this new information. Still could be said that it's just a sensitivity to auditory input that's getting not necessarily the processing of that input. Physical communication, the external information to our sensory systems, the process for the brain to interpret it. I guess sensation, it's talking about that input then? Can I refer to the input as and the output as perception? So is it sort of sensation input, perception output? The line. Hmm. Yeah, I guess that makes sense. Talk about sensation at all. It just talks about input. So I don't know. It makes sense if sensation is just being used as an input in that sort of term. Fail if one were to shift the line between the two. It's so ambiguous. Like, how are we ever supposed to if a study looks like it might be showing an effect? We could just relegate it to being an early sensory and not actually cognitive. Possible to tell, and that's why the re-entrant processing studies were kind of thrown out of the door, you know. But, well, they talk about it as being more or less sensitive to certain input, not necessarily gating it. But yeah, they're basically just saying attention's at the input in some way. Then that's what attention is. It's perception. It's I guess, sensory manipulation, I guess. I don't know. Attention can, in my opinion, act at many stages. It can act later on. But then how do you determine if it's the later on processing, the later on role of attention that's leading to the difference in attention is able to work at both early and late to figure out what's actually going on. Goes lab on contrast sensitivity. The contrast sensitivity. This would be sensation, right? The literal way that the early visual system is interpreting the input. If you're attending to this object, then the input is going to be clearer. You're going to have more resources from the attentional system to be used on that focused attention. That's an example of it being fairly clear that it's sensation and not perception aspects of attention that are more confusing between the two. It's pretty obviously an early visual process, but goals like I don't know, something more complex than simple to one stimulus equals sensation. Is it? Yeah, I don't. Sensation at all. I'm just saying, I don't know. Question. An astute question. I think that cognition I can't even pick a side at this point. Because it depends on your definition and there's not enough evidence either way. It definitely depends on your definition. The same equals sensation. Why do you disagree? Isn't that the input? The retina, the thalamus, and then to the early visual cortex, and then it gets processed a little bit. And it's difficult to say that a simple change in contrast in V1 occurring as after the input's already gotten through. Actually, I don't know. It's impossible to tell. I think early visual processing is not equal to sensation. Definitions, but it's an important definition to make. Really, control over our interpret things, right? Know how we see, then this is such a fundamental question. Have better definitions at this point. Plenty of papers still claim results demonstrate attention is influencing perception. And they tell you that, perception isn't really, you can't really tell. It might be response bias, you need to do another experiment, and then you do that, and then they're like, not really perception anyway, because what if it's just influencing the input? then other people stations being even earlier on, and that's not a problem. It just creates undue havoc in the literature. Back from later areas to early areas, not from input to perception, implies. I mean, I agree. I definitely agree. The problem is that prove an attentional effect in perception simply due to some sort of earlier influence by the feedback, or the feedback is occurring before the processing occurs. And it's hard to tell what the temporal sequence of all this is. I mean, intuitively, I think of attention being feedback from later areas to earlier areas, influencing the processing of that input. It makes sense to me. It's not what they think. That attention is essentially an sensory process, I guess, if we're using that term correctly. Evidence to prove that attentional effects are not. Definition, attention is not a cognitive process. I mean, me and Yulim are in a cognitive control lab, so we might be a little bit biased in thinking that we have control over attention, and control is an inherently cognitive process. So I think there's a dichotomy between the two. Not just a dichotomy between sensation and perception. I think that in this dichotomy, attention is strictly in one of those two. You know, attention can't be both, or it's or there's no evidence that they are both. What Gary's point was in the counter argument. Perception cannot be assumed to be an independent system. Sensation and perception are related. The author's rebuttal, but it's not a very satisfying rebuttal. It's unclear, and there's you can't say that it's one or the other. Attention, if it were influencing both, you could imagine that it's just the earlier input that's playing the role. Peripheral attention merely enhance the processing of the state. Yeah, they do. Peripheral attention means something else. That it's peripheral attention. They don't just say attentional effects. They say peripheral attentional effects, as if there's a difference. And attention is peripheral to the entire cognitive process. Even what they were saying, then they would just say attentional effects. But I guess that they just want to qualify that when they say attention, they mean a side point. It's not actually involved at all. Evidence. It's the dress. I have no idea how they would answer a question thing, because like this is an optical illusion that can't be explained by either of their they gave for all the other optical illusions. Anybody has a chance to talk to these guys, bring up the dress, and whether that's an example of cognition influencing perception. Bring up the points that we made here. I think there are encapsulated sensory stages. What's an encapsulated sensory stage? You mean it being separate? Just like at BSS, everybody was in an uproar about the dress. So many talks about the dress. I think that sensory and perception are interrelated. You know, the input can feed into the cognitive system, and then the cognitive system might then become more sensitive to some of the input. It's sort of a back and forth relationship, perhaps. People still don't really know what's up with the dress. Yeah, it's lighting cues, but that doesn't really explain the full thing. People who wake up earlier might perceive visual cues differently. If that's the case, we should be able to switch between the two. Anyway, and that people have such different reactions to it. That once we see it a certain way, then we have a memory association, and then it kind of falls into the other pitfall of how when we have a memory for something, that changes our perception anyway. The top-down cognitive effect based on past experiences, their perception changes. Memory, right? Or it's automatic inputs, right? I guess. If someone grows up there, if a cat can only see certain oriented lines, then this is dictating their perception, but not cognition necessarily, that's just their experience, right? That's not necessarily a top-down effect. You see horizontal lines because their visual systems become acclimated to certain input, and then it can't be sensitive enough to the other input once it's put out into the world. Typically, we think of past experience as, you know, this is something we have control over, right? We have control over the experiences that we go through in life. Choose to spend my entire life waking up early in the morning, and then a scientist might come to me and say, okay, you're going to interpret this stress differently. It's of a cognitive effect. I don't really know. Again, this is just the problem of attention. Visual system becoming more sensitive to certain things. Even if we had control to make it more sensitive in the first place, we don't have control once that stimulus is presented to us. So we have control up to the point at which we see the stimulus, automatic response that we had no control over, even though we had control over how we would react to the stimulus before it was presented. Kind of confusing. like when I first looked at the article, my assumption was that, of course, cognitive penetrability is probably a thing because of all the studies that were doing it. The thing that really changed my mind was the definitional interpretations that the authors gave. I mean, it is intuitive that closing your eyes changes your perception and you have control over closing your eyes, but obviously that's not influencing perception. And once we interpret on that line of reasoning that the input is a separate system, so saying that attention might just be part of that other system, and it throws these intuitions about cognition influencing perception out the window, and there's very little evidence that fits, or there's no evidence that fits their definitions. What we perceive doesn't mean that cognition can't change perception. Control what we perceive. Cognition can't. Well, I guess that's the problem. What that means, right? Cognition processes that we have the cognitive capacity to manipulate at our own free will. But if we're controlling the inputs, it's technically not cognition anymore too. I really want to. For Yulin's question is that we can control what we perceive, but that extent is very possibly outside the realm of the definitions that the authors give, in the sense that what we can control is how and what we're attending to, and what our priority is in distinguishing our environment. Important, but it's not necessarily cognition, maybe. We can control. We have no, we're not able to control our response to some things. So if I shined a light, you're automatically going to wince, be closing your eyes, assumedly, and then have like a blurry after image, changing your perception, isn't it? And you have no control over that. We can control, but we go about having that, having our visual sent through our retinas to our brain and then interpreted. Tranquilizer. I'm going to email Firestone and Scholl and tell them, did you consider taking a tranquilizer? That's an example about how I can get past all of your loopholes. So I can continue talking about this if anyone has more questions, but I also wanted to just ask if anybody had any about OnNeuro, how it works, or what can be improved, or any suggestions for future meetings.